My father used to say a man who raises his voice has already lost the argument, and a man who stays quiet still has every card in his hand. I didn't understand that until a Sunday morning in late October, when I found my granddaughter sitting on my back porch in her socks. No shoes, no coat, shivering so hard she couldn't get the words out. Some men think patience is the same thing as weakness. I'm here to tell you those are two different animals entirely. Welcome back to the channel. If you've ever had to protect the people you love from someone who thought your kindness meant you'd never fight back, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me down in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We're a community of fathers and grandfathers who understand exactly what it costs to keep a family safe, and I'm glad you're here with me for this one. To understand what happened, you need to understand my son, Daniel. He's 29 now, but I still see the 8-year-old who used to save half his allowance every week just so he could buy his mother flowers on her birthday. Daniel's the kind of man who shovels the neighbor's driveway before his own. When he married Priya 4 years ago, I walked him down to the garage the morning of the wedding and told him the same thing my father told me: take care of her and never let anyone make her feel small in her own house. He nodded like he understood. I don't think he really did. Not yet. Daniel took a job as a project manager at a mid-sized logistics company outside Richmond, Virginia. Long hours, good benefits. The kind of steady work that lets a young family breathe. He and Priya had a daughter, Maya, who just turned 6, all elbows and gap-toothed grins. The kind of kid who narrates her own life out loud without any embarrassment about it. My name is Robert Callahan. I'm 63 years old, and I spent 31 years as a general contractor before I sold my company and moved into commercial property investment, small strip malls, a couple of duplexes, nothing flashy, just steady buildings that pay their own way. If I have a fault, it's that I let things simmer too long before I act. I've always believed that if you give a person enough rope and enough grace, they'll eventually do right by you. That belief nearly cost my granddaughter her safety, and I'll carry that mistake with me for the rest of my life. The trouble didn't start on that October morning. It started 8 months earlier, when Daniel's mother-in-law, a woman named Simone, moved in with them after her divorce. Priya swore it would be temporary, just until Simone got back on her feet. I didn't say anything against it at the time, because that's not my business, whose family stays under whose roof. But Simone had a way about her, a way of rearranging a room the moment she walked into it, of deciding whose opinion mattered and whose didn't. Within a few months, she wasn't a guest anymore. She was running the house. Daniel started working later and later, and every time I called to check in, his voice sounded thinner, like a man being slowly talked out of his own life. The house itself is a story you need to hear, because it matters for everything that comes after. 4 years ago, Daniel and Priya were renting a 2-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner, saving every dollar they could, and I watched my son come home exhausted every night, without ever once complaining. I bought a house for them, a modest brick colonial on Chandler Lane in a quiet part of Chesterfield County, through one of my property holding companies. I didn't hand them the deed. I've built enough buildings and signed enough contracts in my life to know that generosity without structure gets taken advantage of, not out of malice most of the time, just out of human nature. So, I leased it to them for $600 a month, barely enough to cover taxes and insurance, with the understanding that someday, if things stayed steady, I'd sign it over outright. The lease was in Daniel and Priya's names. The deed sat in a file cabinet in my office with my name on it, and almost nobody outside my attorney knew that. That Sunday morning, I was out back trimming the hedges along my fence line, coffee going cold on the porch rail, when I heard the gate latch rattle. Maya came around the side of the house first, and my heart stopped in my chest before my mind even caught up to what I was seeing. She was in her nightgown, no shoes, no coat, and her lips had gone a color I never want to see on a child's face again. Behind her came Priya, moving fast, carrying nothing, her cardigan pulled tight around her, her eyes red and swollen. "Grandpa," Maya said, and that was all she got out before she started crying too hard to speak. I dropped the shears and had that child up in my arms in about 2 seconds, and I could feel her shaking straight through her nightgown. "What happened?" I said to Priya, keeping my voice as level as I could manage, though my hands were not level at all. "Where's your coat? Where's Maya's shoes? What happened?" Priya's teeth were chattering. "Simone told us to leave," she said. "This morning. She said Daniel needs space to think, and that I was," her words were, "poisoning his home. She had the deadbolt changed on Friday. I didn't even know until this morning when my key didn't work." I stood there for a second, holding my granddaughter, feeling something in my chest go very still and very cold, colder than the October morning around us. "Where's Daniel?" I asked. Priya's face crumpled. He didn't stop her. He just stood there. He said, "Give it a few days. Dad'll help us figure it out." My daughter-in-law, standing in my backyard with no shoes on her own feet either, looked at me like she was waiting to be told this was somehow her fault. It wasn't. I want to say that clearly, because too many good women spend too many years believing the chaos in a house is theirs to carry. It never was hers to carry. It was Daniel's, for letting it get that far, and it was about to become mine, because nobody puts a barefoot child out onto a cold porch in my family and gets to call that a private matter. I brought them inside. My wife, Deborah, took one look at Maya's blue lips and had her wrapped in a wool blanket and settled in front of the fireplace before I'd even finished locking the back door. If you're feeling for this little girl right now, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps stories like this one find the people who need to hear them. I got Priya a mug of tea with both her hands wrapped around it to stop the shaking, and I sat down across from her at my kitchen table. "Tell me everything," I said. "From the beginning. Don't leave anything out because you think it makes Daniel look bad. I need the whole truth." It came out slow at first, then all at once, the way these things usually do. Simone had been steadily poisoning the well for months, telling Daniel that Priya spent too much, that she was cold to him, that maybe he'd married too young and too fast. Daniel, exhausted from 60-hour work weeks and starved for anyone telling him he was right about anything, started believing her a little more each week. 2 nights before, Simone had introduced Daniel to a woman from her old book club, a divorced real estate agent named Fiona, who'd been, in Priya's words, conveniently available for coffee and conveniently sympathetic to a tired, undervalued man. Priya said she found text messages. When she confronted Daniel Saturday night, Simone had stepped in before he could even answer, and by Sunday morning, the locks were changed, and Priya and Maya were standing outside in the cold, with nothing but the clothes on their backs. I didn't raise my voice. I want you to understand that, because what happened next only worked because I didn't raise my voice. I finished my coffee. I made sure Maya had dry socks and hot chocolate and my old dog curled up next to her on the rug. And then I went out to my truck and I drove to Chandler Lane. The house looked exactly the way it always had. Brick and white shutters, the maple out front just starting to turn gold. Daniel's gray Tahoe was in the driveway. A car I didn't recognize, a white Lexus with a real estate agency decal on the back windshield, was parked at the curb. I walked up to the front door, and I didn't knock right away. I stood there a moment, looking at that door, thinking about every weekend I'd spent hanging drywall and laying tile in that house so my son could bring his family home to something solid. Then I knocked, 3 times. Hard enough that I felt it in my knuckles. It took a while. When the door finally opened, it was Simone, in a robe, holding a cup of coffee like she was hosting brunch. "Robert," she said, and her voice had that particular brightness people use when they know they've done something wrong and have decided to bluff their way through it. "This isn't really a good time." "I didn't ask if it was a good time," I said. "I asked to see my son." Daniel appeared behind her in the hallway, in sweatpants, looking like he hadn't slept, and behind him, hovering near the kitchen island, was a woman I assumed was Fiona, holding a folder of what looked like real estate listings, which I thought was a strange thing to be holding at 9 in the morning in another family's kitchen. "Dad," Daniel said, and had the decency at least to look ashamed. "Let me explain." "You can explain in a minute," I said. "First, I want to know why my granddaughter was standing on my back porch this morning with no shoes on." Simone stepped forward, the way she apparently liked to do, putting herself between Daniel and any conversation he might have had on his own. "Robert, be reasonable. Priya has not been good for him. He's been miserable for months, and nobody in this family wanted to say it out loud except me." Sometimes love means making the hard call. Fiona here is a wonderful woman. She's stable, she's kind, and frankly, she's what Daniel deserves after years of walking on eggshells. I looked at this woman who had put a 6-year-old out into 38-degree weather without a coat, telling me about love. You changed the locks on a house that isn't yours, I said, and you put a child out in the cold. Whatever you want to call that, I don't call it love. Daniel finally found his voice. Dad, it's my house. I pay for it. I've got a right to decide who's in it, and Priya and I need space to figure things out. It's not your house, son, I said quietly. It never was. He blinked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. What are you talking about? I've paid rent on this place for 4 years. You've paid rent, I said, on a house I own outright through Callahan Property Holdings. The deed has my name on it. It always has. I never told you because I didn't think I'd need to, and because I trusted you'd never do something that would make it matter. The silence that followed was the kind you could have poured concrete into. Fiona set her folder down on the kitchen island very slowly, like it had suddenly become radioactive. Simone's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. That's not possible, Daniel said. The lease has my name and Priya's name on it. It does, I said. And leases have terms, and terms have consequences when you break them. I'll be in touch. I turned around and walked back to my truck, and I did not look back at the house, because I already knew everything I needed to know about the man standing in that doorway, and it broke something in me I hadn't expected to break. That evening, once Maya was asleep and warm in the guest room with my old dog curled up beside her, I sat down in my den and called Grace Whitfield, the attorney who's handled every commercial contract I've signed for the last 20 years, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who's never once lost a case I brought to her. Robert, she said, you sound like a man who's about to ask me something expensive. I told her everything, start to finish, the changed locks, the barefoot child, the woman named Fiona, standing in the kitchen with real estate listings like she was already measuring the curtains. Grace was quiet for a moment. Pull the lease, she said. The one you signed with Daniel and Priya 4 years ago. Do you still have your copy? In my file cabinet, I said. Go get it, she said. I'll wait. I came back with the folder and sat back down. Turn to the occupancy section, Grace said. Should be around clause 11 or 12, depending on the template we used that year. I found it. Clause 12, occupancy and unauthorized residence. Read it to me, she said. I read it aloud. The property was to be occupied solely by the named lessees, Daniel and Priya Callahan, and their minor dependent. Any additional occupant residing on the premises for longer than 14 consecutive days required the express written consent of the lessor, meaning me. Did you ever give written consent for Simone to move in 8 months ago? Grace asked. No, I said. Nobody asked me. Good, Grace said, and I could hear that particular calm in her voice she gets right before she takes someone apart in a deposition. Now find the clause about lockouts. It should be a few paragraphs down. I had it added to your templates back in 2019 after that dispute you had at the Hanover Street property. I found it. If any named lessee alters the locks or security systems of the property without providing the lessor a working key within 24 hours, or wrongfully excludes another named lessee from the premises, the lease may be immediately terminated at the lessor's discretion, and the lessor may take direct possession of the property with proper notice. There it is, Grace said. Daniel didn't just let his mother-in-law walk over his wife. He let her breach a legally binding lease on a property he doesn't own by locking out a co-tenant, which under Virginia law is exactly what this is, an unlawful lockout, and by housing an unauthorized long-term occupant without your consent. You're not just his father in this, Robert. You're the landlord, and you have every right to act like one. What's the fastest way to do this? I asked. We file for immediate possession based on unlawful exclusion of a co-tenant, Grace said. It moves a lot faster than a standard eviction because Virginia courts don't look kindly on people getting locked out of their own homes in freezing weather with a child involved. I can have a judge's order by tomorrow afternoon. Give him 24 hours notice to vacate after that, and then it's over. Do it, I said. Before I hung up, I made one more call. To a man named Wallace, who'd worked as my lead foreman for almost 20 years before I retired. Built like a refrigerator, quiet as a church on a Tuesday, the kind of man who shows up with tools and doesn't ask questions because he already knows what needs doing just from the sound of your voice. Wallace, I said. Chandler Lane property, tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock sharp. Bring the good deadbolts and 2 of the boys. You got it, boss, Wallace said. And that was the whole conversation, because Wallace and I have understood each other for 2 decades, without needing more words than that. I want to pause here and tell you what that night was like in my house, because it matters more than anything that happened at that property the next morning. Maya woke up once around midnight, crying, and I went in and sat on the edge of the bed and told her that nobody was ever going to leave her out in the cold again. Not on my watch, not for as long as I had breath in my body. She fell back asleep, holding on to my sleeve. I sat there another 20 minutes just watching her breathe, thinking about how quickly a man's whole understanding of his own son can shift in the space of one Sunday morning, and how much easier it would have been, and how much less it would have cost me, if I had simply said something 8 months earlier when Simone first started rearranging furniture that wasn't hers to move. Monday morning came in clean and cold, frost on the windshields, the kind of morning that makes everything look sharper than it is. I got the emergency order from Grace's office at 7:40, a single sheet of paper that carried more weight than any contract I've signed in 30 years of business. I drove to Chandler Lane with that paper on the passenger seat, and Wallace's white pickup pulled in right behind me at 8 o'clock exactly, 2 of his men climbing out with drill cases and a box of brand new deadbolts. Daniel's Tahoe wasn't in the driveway. He'd gone to work, apparently believing the previous day's conversation had been some kind of bluff, an old man puffing his chest out over a family squabble. The Lexus was gone too. Only Simone's car remained, a silver sedan parked crookedly in the driveway like she'd been in a hurry the last time she'd used it. I rang the doorbell. It took almost a full minute before Simone answered, still in her robe, and when she saw me standing there with Wallace and 2 men in work jackets behind me, her expression did something complicated, landing somewhere between defiance and dawning panic. "Robert, I already told you," she started. I held up the order, single page, court seal visible at the top. "This is an emergency order for immediate possession, issued this morning by Chesterfield County Court," I said. "Because the locks on this property were changed without my consent, and a legal co-tenant was unlawfully excluded, and because you have been residing here for 8 months without written authorization from the property owner, this lease is terminated, effective this morning. You have 30 minutes to gather your things." Simone's hand tightened on the doorframe. "You can't just walk in here and—" "I'm not walking in," I said. "I'm standing on my own porch, on my own property, with a judge's signature that says so. 30 minutes, Simone. My crew starts changing the locks at 8:30, whether you're finished packing or not." She stared at that paper for a long moment, and something in her face finally cracked, the confidence draining out of it the way air leaves a tire with a slow puncture. She didn't say anything else. She turned and went inside, and I could hear her moving through the house fast, drawers opening, hangers scraping across a closet rod. If you're glad to see somebody finally facing consequences after everything that little girl went through, go ahead and subscribe to the channel now, because we've got a lot more stories like this one coming. At exactly 8:30, Wallace walked past Simone's suitcases in the front hall and got to work on the deadbolts, the whine of the drill cutting through the cold morning air. Simone dragged 2 suitcases and a garment bag down the front steps, her face rigid, refusing to look at me directly. She loaded them into her silver sedan with sharp, angry movements. Before she pulled away, she rolled down her window. "Daniel is going to be furious," she said. "You have no idea what you've just done to this family." I looked at her for a moment. 2 days ago," I said, "you put a 6-year-old girl out in 38-degree weather without shoes on her feet. I'm giving you exactly the same courtesy you gave her. The difference is I have a judge's signature backing mine." She didn't have anything to say to that. She pulled out of the driveway fast enough that her tires kicked gravel against my truck. By 10:15, every lock on that house had been replaced, and the only keys in existence were sitting in my jacket pocket. I sat in my truck for a while afterward, not triumphant, just tired in the particular way a man gets tired after doing something necessary that he wishes had never been necessary in the first place. Around 11, my phone started buzzing. Daniel. I let it ring out. 2 minutes later, it buzzed again. I let that one ring out too. By early afternoon, the missed calls had climbed past 20, and the texts started coming in fast. Dad, what did you do? Dad, my mother-in-law says the locks are changed. Is this some kind of joke? Dad, answer your phone. This is insane. You can't just take a man's house. I didn't answer a single one. I wanted him to sit with that silence for a few hours. The same silence Priya must have sat with while she stood on my back porch that morning trying to figure out where to go. He showed up at Chandler Lane around 5 that afternoon, right as the sky was starting to go the color of a fresh bruise. I was still parked at the curb, waiting, because I knew he would come, the same way I know how a building settles once you've built enough of them. His Tahoe came around the corner too fast and stopped hard behind my truck. He got out and half ran up the driveway, hit the front door, tried his key, and of course it didn't turn. He hit the door with the flat of his hand, once, twice. And then he saw my truck and came storming down the walkway. I rolled my window down about halfway. The cold air came in fast, carrying the smell of wood smoke from somewhere down the street. Dad, what is this? Daniel said, and his voice was cracking in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. You locked me out of my own house? It was never your house, son, I said, keeping my voice as level and quiet as I could manage. It's mine. It's been mine the whole time. You were a tenant, and you broke the lease when you let somebody change the locks and put a co-tenant, your own wife, out into the cold without a coat on her back or shoes on her daughter's feet. I didn't change the locks. Simone did that. I didn't even know until you knew, I said. You stood in that hallway Sunday morning and you let it happen, and you let my granddaughter stand on my porch shivering because you didn't have the spine to tell your mother-in-law no. He grabbed the edge of my window, his knuckles going pale in the cold. Dad, please, this is my whole life, my furniture, everything I own is in that house. Let me back in. Priya and I can figure this out quietly. This doesn't need to be a whole legal thing. I looked at him for a long moment. When Maya came around that fence Sunday morning, I said, her lips were blue, Daniel. She couldn't get words out because she was shaking too hard. You didn't care about doing this quietly then. You cared about doing whatever kept Fiona and her real estate listings comfortable in a kitchen that isn't yours. You forgot something important this week, son. You forgot whose name has been on that deed since the day you moved in. And you forgot who taught you how to be a man in the first place. He stood there with his mouth open, and for the first time since he was a small boy, afraid of a thunderstorm, my son had absolutely nothing to say to me. A moving company will be here at 9 tomorrow morning, I said. They'll pack your things into storage. First month's paid. After that it comes out of your pocket. Don't be here when they arrive. I rolled the window up and pulled away from the curb, and in my mirror I watched him standing alone on that dark sidewalk, in front of a house he could no longer walk into, the porch light throwing a small cold circle of light around his feet. The weeks that followed were not easy ones, and I won't pretend otherwise, because pretending helps nobody. Priya filed for divorce in early November, and because Grace had documented the lockout and the lease breach so thoroughly, Daniel's attorney advised him not to fight her for the house, since it was never his to fight for in the first place. Priya was granted primary custody of Maya without much of a battle, along with a support arrangement Daniel couldn't wriggle out of, and I signed the deed to Chandler Lane over to Priya outright in December, free and clear, because that little girl deserved to grow up in a house nobody could ever lock her out of again. As for Daniel, I still talk to him. He calls most Sundays now. It's not the relationship we had before, and I don't know if it ever will be exactly that again, but he's in counseling. He stopped taking calls from Fiona, and last month he showed up to Maya's school play early, sat in the front row, and cried through the whole thing like the boy I remembered raising. I was at Priya's house last week, the week before Thanksgiving, fixing a loose porch step that had been bothering me since October, and Maya came out in her coat and her boots this time, both laced up tight, and sat down next to me on the step, just to talk about nothing in particular, about a hamster her class was getting, and a book she was reading about sharks. I watched her breath fog up in the cold air, safe, warm enough, laughing about something that had nothing to do with any of what her family had been through, and I felt something in my chest finally settle all the way down. I didn't feel like celebrating that night, and I still don't, not really. There was no part of any of this that felt like winning. What I felt, sitting on that porch step next to my granddaughter, was something quieter than triumph and a great deal more important. A man's job, especially once he's earned some gray in his hair, isn't to go looking for a fight or to hold on to anger longer than it serves a purpose. It's to make absolutely certain that when the people he loves get pushed out into the cold, there's a door somewhere that will always open for them, and somebody standing behind it who was paying attention the whole time. That's the whole of it. That's what my father was trying to tell me all those years ago, and it only took me 63 years and one cold October morning to finally understand him completely. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of the lengths a father or a grandfather will go to protect the people who can't protect themselves, take a second to subscribe, leave a like, and share it with somebody who needs the reminder that it's never too late to stand up for your family. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and tell me about the person in your life who taught you what it really means to protect somebody. Take care of each other out there, and I'll see you in the next story.